we're now moving from the world of statistics, previous conversation about economics, to the desperately concrete world of how to create cities and urban environments and community environments that are supportive of small children and that are informed by the insights of ECD science. This is a wonderful session that is like nothing we've ever done before. Patrin from the Bernard Van Leer Foundation is going to introduce Tara Eisenberg, who's the program manager of the Gehl Institute. And then we're going to go for a walk, and you guys will tell us how we're going to do that. And then we're going to come back and talk some more before the end of the session. So, take it away.
Thank you, Bruce. Good afternoon, everyone. So my purpose is indeed to introduce Tara, who we're very, very happy to have here. But Tara and Kate Black have very kindly suggested that I should take a few minutes to also talk a little bit to you about our Urban 95 program in order to give some context to why Tara is here today. So I'm going to start out by asking you to help me answer this question, drawing on everything you've heard in the last 2 days. How do you think a city shapes the developing brain? For good or for bad? Just quick hands. Depends on the city, but what are some things that it might do or not do? Annabelle. Yep, pollution. Say it again, sorry. Violence, right? Community violence, street violence. Yes, yes, absolutely. Others? Melis? Yes. Yep, absolutely. Thank you. Melis? Yes. Yep, difficult to play, nowhere to play. Perfect. Jack? Yes. Right, and everyone, Jack's actually written a very interesting article about that, the London Paradox, which is showing that you can explain it better. Yep, great, thanks. So cities can also be fantastic places to grow up as well. Others? Yeah, lack of basic sanitation, sewage, healthcare, etc. Okay, one more. Yep, lack of nature. Okay, all right, thank you so much, everyone. You basically explained one of the slides, which you'll see later, which is great. As you know, we work on early childhood development. We've been working on early childhood development for the last 50 years. And we do that because we believe that all children should have a good start in life, no matter where they're born. So what does a child need to have a good start in life? We've seen some of these things over the last 4 days. This is the way that I like to explain it. It's not the technical way, but to me, this is a very simple way to think about the key ingredients in a child's development. The first is nutrition. Developing body needs the right nutrients. Second is protection. We heard very compellingly from Dr. Burke Harris about the protection that you need from adverse childhood experiences that disrupt child development. And you need play. Esther, my colleague over there, can tell you a little bit about how even really tiny children, the newest babies, play. But play is how children learn, so play is absolutely critical. And then finally, you need love. We heard about the importance of love to buffer children from the pretty terrible things that are happening to a lot of kids around the world. But you also need love not only to protect, but also literally to build the brain. Every conversation, every song, every kiss, every conversation back and forth, what you see there is literally making that happen. That's what we heard from Chuck Nelson yesterday. So here's the thing. Cities can make it really difficult for that to happen, and that's because of all of the things that you all brought up just now. It's lonely. You're far away from your support systems if you've just moved there. It's stressful. Nature is far away. You can't find anywhere safe to play or to relax. There's air pollution. There's noise pollution. And increasingly bad in a lot of cities around the world is it's just difficult to get anywhere. It's dangerous, it's unsafe, it's crowded, and so you can't even get to healthcare or childcare, and you're spending a lot of time and you're very stressed out. So these are real problems, and it's a real public health issue. So hence, our work on Urban 95 is what we're trying to do about it. There are three key things about Urban 95. The first is that it's a focus on the youngest children, the under fives, as well as their caregivers. The second is working with city government on a citywide scale. And then the third is attention to how the built environment shapes child development. I'd like to talk a little bit about that last one. So Joan talked a little bit this morning about place-based strategies for early childhood development. And these are these programs all over the world that are increasingly looking at how to coordinate early childhood services across a specific geographic area. So these are great initiatives because they are combining health, early learning, protection, and looking at how do you coordinate that and make it more effective and impactful and efficient in a specific geographic area, and keeping the family at the center. But what we're saying is that a lot of these initiatives, not all of them, but a lot of them, are only looking at these aspects of what a city is doing, the social services, the health, the education, and so on. They are not looking at transportation, parks, public works. And if all of you who live in cities can think about how the decisions that those departments make shape every day of your life, you can also think about how they shape the lives of young children. You know, one of the things we like to say is that the greatest services in the world aren't much use if you can't get to them. So what we're asking cities to do is figure out how to make less of this, all of the stressors, the negative risk factors for child development, and do more of this. So I am going to first show you a little bit of a video before I go into some examples.
Beanie, it's a bus. Bus. Wheels on the bus go round and round. Round and round. Round and round. Wheels on the bus go round and round. All through the town. Goes the bus, Bee. Hi, bus. Hi, bus. Okay, it's all gone. All gone. Somebody should know what this is called. It's gone. Okay, should we walk this way?
Okay, so that was not an excuse to show a video of my toddler and our very good friend to a captive audience. I was actually trying to make 3 points. One is that babies and toddlers are always going to be found with their adults. You don't see kids under 3, sometimes 4 and 5, but not kids under 3 wandering around the city by themselves. And so that means that if you're a city and you're thinking about how to make life better for the young kids, you need to think about what their caregivers need as well. The second is that play is happening everywhere. I think you all know this. It's not just in a playground, but it's also not in a bounded public space. You know, my son there, he was talking to people on the street. He was running round and round the trees that were planted on the street. He was walking down the lines. He was just everywhere. And kids are just playing everywhere that they can find. The final point is you can imagine how long it took us to get to our destination. I think this was a half-mile walk. I don't know how long we spent on the street. This is a very easy place to get around in. This is Cambridge, Massachusetts, a few months ago. So many of you come from very crowded, very busy cities, and you can just imagine how difficult it is to get around. And if you can't get to the things you need, it's not a matter of inconvenience. It can be a matter of life or death, and it's certainly a matter of unhealthy child development. So what we're doing is we ask cities to think about, literally, if you could experience the city from 95 centimeters, which is the height of a healthy 3-year-old, according to the World Health Organization growth chart, what would you change? And the reason we came up with this idea is because we found that in talking to city planners, city designers, city leaders, they tend to think very concretely. They wanted to know, okay, this is great, we want to do something for little kids, but what do you mean? And then we found that thinking about it from a very concrete spatial perspective actually helped people to understand that better. Okay, so what would you change? So here are a few ways that we're thinking about it. One is, what are you doing about the location and quality of public space if your goal is to create opportunities for play and relaxation everywhere? So this is a small project we're funding as part of our Urban 95 Innovation Challenge program in Tucumán, Argentina. So a group of architects got together and they mapped all of the vacant lots in the city, and they identified the ones in red as the ones that were most promising for turning into places where families could get together and play with their babies and toddlers. So they've gone from this to this. And the thing here, as I mentioned, is that they're everywhere. They're very easy to get to. And so if you're dragging a baby or a screaming toddler along with you, you can get there much easier than if you've got a fantastic park like Central Park that's 2 miles away. That's not much good to you if you've got a little kid with you. Second, what would you do with neighborhood layouts and transport systems if your goal is to make it easier for caregivers with young children to get to where they need to go and have fun along the way? So one project we like, this is an initiative in Sao Paulo, Brazil. I'm not sure if it's going on anymore, but it's one of our favorite examples. They were providing free transportation vouchers to pregnant women to help them get to prenatal health checkup. Third, what would you do with the location and quality of early childhood services if your goal was to make sure that you got high quality, easy access for the most vulnerable? One of the challenges with cities is that you don't always have neighborhood level data for child development outcomes, or you don't necessarily even know where the young children are. And so finding that out is really key because, as we've been saying all along, proximity, distance travel is really important. So a professor in Istanbul did a really groundbreaking study. This is the first ever social map of Istanbul. And what he did was he used property values as a proxy for income. Property values are something that every city has because that's where they're collecting property taxes. And he was able to use statistical techniques to figure out where the youngest children were, who were also the poorest. Joan said this morning that poverty is unfortunately a very, very good proxy for poor child development outcomes. So using this map, they could figure out where the poor and vulnerable young children were, and they could target their services more effectively. And this is just last year, but the municipality is already starting to use it in some of their decisions. This is a home visiting program that just started in Istanbul, and this is the first ever home visiting program there. Some of the speakers the last couple of days have been talking about the effectiveness of home visiting programs in terms of improving child development outcomes. And so this is a very lovely one with a 21-day-old baby taken a couple of months ago. And then finally, what would you do through city management if your goal was to get interagency investment in early childhood? We've heard a lot over the last couple of days of the importance of collaborating between sectors. And for a city, that means you're needing to collaborate among public space, parks, health, education, et cetera, and really thinking concretely and together about what it means to be investing in early childhood in your city. So in Tirana, Albania, we're funding their first chief child development officer, who is 2 people there. That's 2 people there who are reviewing all city policies for impact on babies and toddlers. So there's a couple of different initiatives going on like that around the world, and we're very excited about the potential for that. So finally, Tel Aviv, Israel, is one of our most advanced Urban 95 city partnerships. And this is a quote from the mayor of Tel Aviv, which he's saying, "Tel Aviv is always interested in implementing new ideas that could improve the quality of life for our residents. We are excited to be among the first cities in the world to be thinking seriously about how addressing the issues faced by our youngest citizens could have wider ramifications for making the city a better place to live." Now, this is interesting because it's showing both his commitment to early childhood, but also noting that doing that, he sees that as a way to make the entire city a better place to live for everyone. This here is Rabin Square. So Rabin Square, for those who don't know, is like it is to Tel Aviv as Tiananmen Square is to Beijing or Trafalgar Square is to London. It's a very significant politically and publicly place in Israel. It's where Yitzhak Rabin got assassinated in 1995, for example. So it's a very politically important place for the city and for the country. And last month, the city, as part of their Urban 95 program, put on an event called Playing in the City, which was highlighting the importance of play between parents and children for healthy development and healthy societies. And a funny anecdote that our Israel representative told us, this event was going on at exactly the same time as the Eurovision contest. And the winner happened to be an Israeli. And so I didn't know this, but the tradition is that the winner of the Eurovision contest has to go back to their country and do a pop-up public performance immediately. It really has to be right away. And so they were in a bit of a dilemma because this was the obvious place to have it, but they didn't know what to do because the event was still going on. So what they ended up doing was putting up the Eurovision concert, having it, and then the next day they put all of this stuff back up at quite significant trouble and cost. And it's a really nice indication, I think we feel, of how important this work is to the city leadership. And the reason I'm saying this is because the turning point was a study tour that the organization Terra works for hosted in Copenhagen in December, just a few months ago. But we took the leaders of all of the city departments in Tel Aviv to Copenhagen to be hosted by Gehl, to be inspired by public space, to be inspired by the Gehl approach to designing cities for people. Which every time I say that, I feel like, well, aren't cities supposed to be for people? But I'm sure you can talk about some of the ways in which they're not designed for people. And we're early childhood people. We are not urban people. So when we first started working on Urban 95, we spent a lot of time talking with stakeholders around the world, people who knew this space of who we should be partnering with, who we should be working with to really try to make something happen. And the name of Gehl kept coming up over and over again. They are expert at watching how people actually live and move and use public space and designing cities to foster a healthy, vibrant public life. So Tara works for Gehl Institute, which is the nonprofit arm of Gehl with the same mission. She is a lifelong New Yorker, currently living in Brooklyn, so she's very suited to this work. She worked previously in green building and sustainability. And this is not in your official bio, Tara, so you can tell that I stalked your LinkedIn. But she not only has a master's in environmental education and conservation, but she also has a bachelor's in studio art and mathematics, which I think is both really interesting and a very nice analogy for the kind of both analytical and empathetic thinking that you need to work and do this work. So I'm very happy she could come be with us today, and I'll hand over to you.
For giving value to that degree. Still trying to figure out what to do with it. But I do think that there is an intersection between art. Oddly enough, my undergrad was considered a Bachelor of Science, and my graduate degree was a Bachelor of Art. So it's all the same anyway, apparently. So thank you all for coming. I understand many of you are journalists, but I would imagine that you all have other disciplines as well or other interests. Is anyone here? Would anyone here consider themselves an urban planner of any sort? One in the back. Okay. Is anyone here urban? And you've planned something, so. It's not the same, but we'll get there today. Today we're all urban planners, and we'll be investigating the city together. So as Patrin noted, I'm with the Gehl Institute, and I've lived in cities for a long time. I've worked in cities. I used to be a child a long time ago, and now I'm older. So I know a thing or two about this from experience and from studying with the Bernard Van Leer Foundation and working on projects with you all. But at the end of the session, what I'd like to get to is to learn what interest you think there is or isn't. Tell me, forget it, don't do this, in telling stories about this process and how you would see others relating to this and others actually connecting and identifying with some of these questions. And as Patrin noted, what does cities for people mean, right? And aren't cities for people? And, I would argue that cities are for more than people. Cities are for nature. A lot of open spaces and a lot of what we find in public spaces appealing has to do with nature and things that we didn't artificially put there. And so I personally would like to expand that definition of cities for people to be cities for people in nature, in cities, if that's possible. But a lot of times when you're going through the day, even just getting on or off the train, if you've taken the subway or the metro since you've been here, you might notice some of the, some of the trains do have a person talking, which is nice. And some of the trains have a robot, which was a person at some point. I think it's like a neutral woman from the Midwest voice in some cases, and sometimes it's a man. But they'll say, like, let the passengers off the train before you enter. And so the MTA has not called us people or humans. We're passengers, or we're customers, or we're visitors, or we're clients. And so, yes, the city's for people, but it's also for commerce. It's also for transportation. I loved your toddler's transportation song. He's already like getting on board with public mobility, which is cool. So it's all around us. And our mission, as Patrin kind of mentioned, was to transform the way cities are shaped by making public life an intentional driver for design, policy, and governance. And when I say public life, I don't mean like, finding celebrities recycling or something like that. I mean the social activity that takes place in everyday public spaces. And so anything you do that's outside of your private property, your home, your car, that's what we would consider public life. And we feel that a healthy, vibrant public life is actually really essential to public health, to physical health, to our mental state. And we put people first planning, policy, and design as the center of what we do. And we think about how we can expand that knowledge and how we can actually push for changes in cities. So is it at the grassroots advocacy level? Is it at the individual level? Is it at the policy level? Do we need all mayors to be on board with having a public life agenda? We're still trying to figure out, what the lever is, and there's not just one switch. So we kind of refer to our plan of attack as the sandwich theory, because we're kind of working at the top and the bottom and trying to squish into the middle kind of meaty part to make that delicious mayo-y change. And so planning, designing, and evaluating the needs of young children in public space is what we're talking about today, and how that can lead to a better society for all. So I think it was maybe Gehl Peñalosa who's credited with saying that children are an indicator species, right? And if, as Patrin mentioned, a city is comfortable and safe and equitable for children, then it will be so for everyone. And you'll often, you'll benefit from these little elements of play, from these little elements of curiosity, right? I think we all struggle to want our lives to be a bit easier, but just like a child with a developing brain, having this right balance of challenges and ease is really what is interesting to us and what stimulates our minds as adults as well. And so we say that public space is the living room of cities, and the evolution of public space was starting from this kind of necessary place where people needed a spot to share goods and services, to have the market, to have the commons and the green. And now it's the difference between, living on top of each other in dirty, filthy quarters versus actually sharing space that we can cultivate together, and it suits our needs both recreationally and socially. And we've talked about the developing brain quite a bit, but even though there is this kind of, irrevocable period that you can't get back from age 0 through 5, where your brain's developing at a critical rate, and you're, creating thousands of new neurons and neurological connections, and that sadly the slump kind of flatlined after age 5. But I think there's still hope for us to develop new skills and new brain connections just a little bit after age 5. And so actually having those social connections and keeping us connected and interacting is important throughout our lives, but particularly when we're young. And so there is this overlay of these other systems that public life can help to flourish in our lives and in our city lives and in society. And so this is why a city should care about public life, right? Because it does have to do with safety, eyes on the street. There are many times where we'll try to put up fences or floodlights or something to make a space safe, but really what makes you feel safe is the presence of other people and people who you trust and you empathize with, and you feel some kind of familiarity or, social connection. And that's what really contributes to mental well-being. There's more physical activity associated with people who are willing to interact with other people. And having, just this free space where you don't have to buy something, where you can just be, where it can just be for you, and sharing the street, which makes up something like 25 to 30% of all of our public spaces. And we don't even think of it as our space often. We think of it as a place we're kind of passing through, unless there's some kind of, pop-up event or block party or something like that. But it's ours. We're paying for it. So we should optimize how we use it. And even though you probably know that inherently, how often do we do something with that information? For most of us, it's not that often, unless it's your job. It's also about, comfort. So providing shading and lighting and nature, which we talked about, and thinking about who's welcome in a space and who's not, and how is that indicated? How is that conveyed to us? How is inclusivity or exclusivity demonstrated through fences and furniture and cleanliness and maintenance and access. It's often something that, again, we kind of take for granted as something we don't have control over, but we do. And we know that poor quality places inhibit well-being. So these are just a few examples that don't picture children in them, but you can imagine how this picture on the left, for example, is a street that doesn't really have a sidewalk, but people are walking. So the design and the actual use of the space doesn't match. How would a child fare on this sort of street or this sort of design? I had mentioned the issue of maintenance. So this photo in the middle depicts something we also see often as some trash container that's not well maintained. It's not well used. People aren't, separating what they're putting in there. People are maybe putting household trash in there, but you can see it's not a place you'd want your child to be around. Children near the ground are often picking things up and tasting them and smelling them, and you wouldn't want them doing that by that trash can. And then, of course, terrain. This is maybe some terrain that's been historically protected or something. It looks like some really nice slate, but it's not good for if you have a stroller or you're, impaired in some way and need to rely on wheels. It looks very dangerous. And then if, oftentimes we'll have the best of intentions. This is maybe some kind of lunch spot outside of a corporate office park, but no one's using it because there's really no shade, there's no protection, there's nothing visually appealing, right? And then, of course, you've got the situation, which we see all the time. The stairs are not well maintained, they're not well designed, there's not another option. And so anytime in the public realm that you see something like this, just think it could be better. We could do something about this. And that's really what we're thinking about. So we know that a happy brain needs 1,000 stimuli per hour, which is once every 4 seconds to keep us interested in something. And arguably this facade, which I think is part of Columbia somewhere, but it might be their other campus. Someone tried to design it a little more interestingly than what's happening here, but it's still just a facade that this guy is going to walk by and he's not going to stop and see anything or look at anything. And we really want to think about how we can make our environments more vibrant and more active. So if we're thinking of the street as a place, how can we avoid this situation and think more about this situation? So you can see, for example, this trash bin on the right is well maintained. There's not trash around it, and the kids can play kind of near it. The kid in the middle isn't going to get run over because there's some kind of protection there. And then on the left, you've got a nice wide sidewalk with some cobblestones indicating that cars probably won't approach you. And so kids can kind of set up shop there and do something creative or good for their community. But how do cities think about this stuff, right? So, arguably some people in cities, governments, are parents, right? But are they thinking about young children at their job, at their desk every day and connecting it to their job? Or are they thinking, I want to get home and see my kids and not connecting it back to what they're doing? And some people are and some people aren't. And our mission is to really bring those two things together. So public space is not just about efficiency and numbers and geometry and customers and clients and passengers, but it's also about the experience. So we design the city, but then the city kind of shapes us. And it's this virtuous cycle, potentially, if we're doing things right. And often there are unintended consequences of well-intended design. But if we go back and we try to evaluate what happened and we observe and we look and we measure, we might potentially have an opportunity to go back and iterate and fix that and do something a little more interesting or a little bit better for our mutual health and our benefit. So the Gehl Institute, we feel that we are the key as people. So even though cultures and climates are different from city to city, the experience of the environment is generally at the same starting point. The human dimension is what we call the starting point. And so this is the eye level that we keep referring to. The eye level of an average size adult might be around 170 centimeters, and the average, even though the height is perhaps 95 centimeters of a healthy 3-year-old, the eye level is a little bit lower. So we'll say that's about 90 centimeters or so. And no matter where you're from, it's rare to be taller than 1 story, right? So we're all sort of in the same airspace, and we all walk or move at around 3 miles or 5 kilometers an hour. And when we think about the difference between the large scale kind of places that have this undefined shape and size that are created for 50 mile per hour journeys through cars and efficiency and business and commerce, those create unpleasant sensory experiences, and they're not as social and inviting, and they don't activate our senses, which is important because we learn a lot of what we know through our 5 senses. In many cases, I think something like 75% of our impressions are through sight as adults, but for kids, that's quite different, and I don't know the exact breakdown, but kids learn a lot through taste and touch, and that changes as we grow older, but there's still a lot of input that we receive, and if it's for learning purposes or for enjoyment or for connection, it's better that we focus on how we perceive our environment through those senses than for money and for efficiency. Like there's got to be a connection, and so what we experience at the eye level is really important, and that's what we'll talk about today. I'll give you a little bit just of the background of how we got to this point. So the Gehl Institute is the namesake of Jan Gehl. Has anyone heard of or is familiar with Jan Gehl at all? So are you familiar with Jane Jacobs? So I say he's like the Dane Jacobs, but thank you, Patrin. She gets my jokes. He's Danish, and he's an urban planner who, in the 60s or so, was and is married to a psychologist named Ingrid, and he's an architect, an academic, really, but he studies architecture and urbanism and urban planning. And she asked him, "How come none of your drawings have people in them? Well, how can you design buildings if you don't know what people want or what people do?" And he was like, "Oh, that's a good point." Shoot. And so they got funding to start studying the intersection of people and design and psychology and urban planning, really, and how do people behave in space. And one of their findings was that there's these distances that range from intimate distance to public distance, and in the middle, personal distance and social distance is a lot of where our interactions will take place. So social distance is why you would feel very comfortable on a stoop or a porch or something that's in between 4 feet and 12 feet, where you can be social with people passing by, but you can retreat into your own space. And this is not scientifically proven, but I feel like this is why people are always hanging out in the kitchen at a party, is because it's around that size. You can retreat and you can be social, and that's a very comfortable place for us to be in. And if you think about that distance when you're designing spaces, you will arguably have a better chance at designing a space that people feel safe in, but feel some camaraderie in as well, and everything in between. And we have to understand the different degrees of socializing, so we can invite for that difference. So you have options. This is especially important for young children because, as we know, their brains are developing at a very rapid pace when they're young, and this social connection for children is very important on their brain development. And we've all read about studies where, children who are in foster care or are not hugged or don't have interaction with other kids are much less likely to flourish later in life and to thrive and to develop healthy behaviors than children who do have contact with people and who are cared for and nurtured in a real way. And that's not to say that there's always one or the other. Of course, there are children who have an upbringing where there's less interaction, and later in life they can adjust. But for the most part, we want to try to encourage this range of socializing degrees that in the community and in the public life and in the public space actually enable us to become healthy, flourishing adults. And so we need that diversity and that flexibility and the proximity. And again, this all has to do with human scale. So for children, the overlays of the different systems are, often invitations to play and the sense of place and adaptable space, so places that do multiple things. And of course, safety is very important. And this is Yan, who I mentioned. And so he says we measure what we care about. And when he noticed that the public realm was measured for speed and reliability and flow and capacity, but people experience things on a very slower basis and a very lower basis, how our body feels, what other people are doing. Are we hungry? Are we tired? Are we hot? Are we cold? It's very different than what cities measure, which is cars moving by and waiting time for transit. It doesn't translate into our feelings always, right? And that really dictates how we behave, and then how we feel in a space is the most important thing to us often. And so how do you kind of correct for that? If you want to know what a city cares about, you can look at their budget. And so the New York City budget, for example, has a large chunk for education, a large chunk for social services, police and fire, et cetera. But where's the public life in there? You can see there's this little chunk for parks and transportation. And then you start to think about, okay, so public life is sprinkled throughout where they're spending money, but where do young children in public life fit in? And so you might notice that everywhere is really the answer, but how do you carve that out, and how do you be deliberate about spending that money for children in public life in a really meaningful way that actually can be measured later? And so that next year you can say explicitly in the budget, these are the percentages of these different chunks that we actually want to make sure is explicitly used for this purpose and isn't just sort of a byproduct of some other decision that was made for some other reason. And this is where we can really, start to make a difference. And this is really where we want to put numbers so that we can do that. So, not to belabor the point, but when you go outside, you experience the city and the landscape as one place. But when you go back to the budget, you see it's broken into different chunks. So trying to reconcile that is something that if we want to make a difference as planners, as city agents, as advocates for these systems, this is where we probably want to focus. We want to overlay the social and physical resilience. And so we need to understand who feels included and why. This is a really long build up to, in God we trust, everyone else bring data, right? So where do we get this data from? And why do we care? So the Gehl Institute has tried to democratize the data and the collecting of the data a bit. And that's why we've handed out these field guides to you. If everyone doesn't have a field guide, you can team up with someone who does and share it and to look through for now. And then when we go outside, I apologize, I didn't have the correct total number that would be in the class. So sharing is caring. And we make these tools available on our website for counting people in space and observing people in space. And you'll see it's not rocket science. It's not anything that you might not have been able to come up with on your own. But I wonder, has anyone ever actually stood out in a place and counted people walking by? 1, 2, 3. What did you notice anything, or did that change your perception of a space? Just anyone who's counted it? Well, I'm curious to see what you find out today. You're nodding, but did you have something to add? Exactly. So there's things you think kind of anecdotally about the way people use space, but I'm going to be curious to see what you actually observe today and what you notice that might be different from your perception. And so, oftentimes when we take these tools out into the field, we'll want to go out with a research question like, do families use this place? Would be a very simple one. Or do women feel safe in this place? Or do young children find places to play in this space or something? And so you might want to just take a minute before we go outside to think about what a question is that you might want to answer or observe. We'll just be going out right here into campus immediately outside, and then we'll also be going around the corner to Morningside Park to some of those green spaces there, and we'll kind of be able to see and compare the difference. And I want to make sure we've got a good bit of time to do that. So I'm just going to run through the rest of this quickly, but some more kind of nebulous questions we're asking ourselves that the tools might not answer directly are, what makes a space worth spending time in? Or who feels invited? Who's not here? Who feels excluded? It's hard to tell because they're not there, but it's something you can think about. Who feels safe and supported? How do we measure the social effect? what is the most inclusive process for collaboration? How are people navigating the city? How do we make change happen? And then the question that's not on here that, Patrin posed is, how does a child perceive this space? How does a family interact here? How do caregivers interact here? Where do they go afterward? How does this fit into their day? What does this mean for a child, for a family? And then how might the Urban 95 agenda inform the kinds of public life data we collect to be able to design better spaces and cities and systems for young children and families? So what we measure is what we can see. You'll notice there's not much in here about, ethnicity or background or things that we really can't observe. There's complementary to some of the tools in here are also tools that are a little more subjective, but they involve more direct interaction and self-reported data from people passing by. So, for example, we have something called a participant survey where you will ask people, how often do you visit this space? How would you identify ethnically? What neighborhood are you from, et cetera? And we do encourage that when you do a study like this, that you cross-reference some of that data with the self-reported data of people so you can get a more kind of 360 vision of what's happening in a space. But today we're just focusing on what we can see and observe. And again, I'm curious to hear your feedback on if you think there's more that's observable or stuff that shouldn't be in here that you feel isn't observable. So objectively, counting people walking and cycling, something you can count. Tallying age and gender, this is something that's a little less observable, but we're going to try to do it. So the age and gender tool, for example, on page 10 it starts. We broke down the categories. Typically, we'll just do age 0 through 4, but for the purpose of this exercise, we broke them down into the developmental milestones that actually Esther works really closely with identifying. So 0 to 6 months is what we're calling a newborn, 7 to 12 months is what we're calling an infant, a year to 3 years is a toddler, and then 4 and 5 years would be like a pre-K child. If you don't spend a lot of time with children, it's shockingly hard, I think, to identify their age. So it's your best guess. We don't have gender on that section, not only because, well, I think assigning gender to such a young child is not always accurate anyway, but it's certainly very hard to visibly identify, right? And then everyone else, there's male, female, or other, not sure, which are our best guesses at how you can observe and count for different people, but I'm curious to hear your feedback on all of that. We also map how people spend time. So that would be the stationary activity mapping exercise, which starts on page 23. And then we've got this much more extensive chart on here where we can mark someone's gender, their age, which we tried to make it a little easier on you. We're not asking you to distinguish between 6 or 7 months, but the other categories remain. Good luck. Who's in a group, who's alone, are they sitting, standing? There's nothing for leaning. So again, you'll see things that you don't know exactly how to mark, but take your best guess. And then what activity is someone doing? Again, you'll see activities not on here, like someone's meditating. Is that a cultural activity? Is that waiting for transport? I don't know, but take your best guess. We try to make these things observable, but this is the interesting thing about going out is people aren't this shape. We're doing our own thing and we're unpredictable. So that's why it's exciting to see what that is and take our best guess at designing and improving our systems based on what we actually see and not what we think people will want to do, right? We also surveyed the social dimensions of public space and the interaction. That's a little bit about are people in a group, are people alone, and then the spatial components. So you can also, mark down where you see a bench or a tripping hazard or something like that. We did add a few questions here that are separate from the tools that are on page 22 of just observations that might pertain specifically to the Urban 95 agenda. So are there terrain or obstacles that make it difficult for children to navigate, et cetera? And you can just we'll try to visit, at least 2 spaces outside. So if you can answer for both, or there's no right or wrong to use this field guide. And we'll talk about it after. So on the left here, you'll see we have qualitative tools. So this is the 12 quality criteria tool. And then we also have the quantitative tools, which we just talked about. So this is the one qualitative tool that we did include. It doesn't involve talking to people. You can just use your own opinions. And that starts on page, toward the back, 30. So the 12 quality criteria is broken out into levels of protection. That's the top row. Comfort is the next two rows. Enjoyment is the bottom. And you'll see that the only place where we're asking really questions about the physical environment are really under protection. Comfort and enjoyment is pretty subjective, and we're asking you to answer with smiley or frowny faces. So again, not very scientific, but weirdly helpful when you're trying to design and evaluate spaces. We've tailored all of these to try to think about what a young child and a caregiver might be looking for in a public space, but again, we're very open to your suggestions. For example, I think a group of Bernard Van Leer researchers or participants use this in Bhubaneswar, India, and they said, there should be something indicating where there's healthy or unhealthy food vendors, which, yes, but again, like very subjective. So if you see things or you have suggestions, please tell me. We're always changing these. These are not hard and fast tools. So the templates on our site are like the most basic version, and then we have the InDesign package so you can adapt it to whatever you're trying to measure. When we're comparing things, you want to try to use the same tools for whatever you're comparing, but across different studies, it's totally what you make of it. So these are just starting points. The people moving, we talked about, and I'll talk a little more detail about how you actually use the tools. Walking, cycling, age and gender, people staying. So what invites a person to stay or a group of people to stay? What invites them to move through or perform different activities? Again, I would guess that it'll be a little bit different than what you might think it would be. And then we're counting and mapping different postures so that we know how to use a space better. And then public space quality, that's the quality criteria, and asking people to tell us what they think would be the participant survey, which we're not going to subject you to today. We'll come back and we'll talk about this. And I'd like to hear how you think about different systems that the public spaces interact with. So for example, you'll see people maybe waiting for transit or moving through or taking a tour. So where does that overlay with education or health or welfare or resilience? And it's, again, probably different than what you might think before you go outside. And then we're going to talk about how data can help us tell stories or shape better designs. So if we were to do this in a real study, we probably wouldn't put this in a stapled booklet because we'd want to scan it in, and then we'll want to translate all the data into some kind of chart where we can tally and compare the numbers and measure and come back and say, wow, a lot of people are waiting for the bus, but there's nowhere to sit. Maybe our design should include some better seating for that. Or, wow, there's 95% men in this park. Why? What should we do? What kind of programming would invite for more gender diversity in a park? And it's simple things like that that can really change the feel of a space and can really change the public realm for the better and make it more vibrant. So I'll stop there. I can take a couple of questions and then we'll go out into the field and try some of these tools. Does anybody have questions? Yeah?
Okay, I live in Abuja, Nigeria. It was a city that was created in 1976. But if you go there right now, public parks have been overtaken by shops selling alcohol and cigarettes. I'm just wondering, the impact of this on children who are going to this park. And I'm just looking at the story angle. And I'm thinking, writing this kind of story, what angle can you take to bring it into public limelight so that people will actually appreciate and identify with it and see a way they can do something about it?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So what are the hard metrics? What are the evidence that would show why you'd want to park over a shop? Is that essentially the crux of this question?
Public health implication of having shops selling alcohol and cigarettes around public parks.
Yeah. So why would you want to have more diversity there, more activities for families and children?
Yeah, because these shops have taken over the parks, and in other places the churches have also taken these parks, taken over the parks. There are no spaces for children to play.
Yeah. I think it's up to us to, again, translate that data into a story about why that's better or worse, and what we should do about it. So, some of the main indicators that we'll typically use are, social connections bring more trust and empathy, create a safer society for overall, so there's less crime. And if you notice that people aren't interacting, aren't having this passive contact, it's much more likely that people would not promote safety in their environment. You could argue if there's more garbage or less maintenance in a place that maybe people don't collectively care about it or take care of it, and that's something that we can measure. You can also think about how kids are not safe or there's problems there. In terms of social isolation and building these social connections, there's a lot of indicators that stress and loneliness and isolation are some of the biggest health risks for people. And so promoting those connections actually reduces health costs for a city and for a person. So all of these inputs, again, are kind of soft and around the edges. And so it's really how you tell that story. And if you were to think about, what a pilot pop-up activity might look like that's different from the commerce, or getting the shopkeepers or the vendors involved in some kind of process that promotes some other kind of activity, and then measuring the difference of these various metrics that you've set up and trying to use that information to shape how a space is used could show positive results, which we've seen in other places.
Hi. Oh, sorry. I was wondering what your experiences of public-private partnerships in the space. So, for example, a pilot space which a brand might pay for, but have their name kind of strewn all over it. What are the challenges with that? And do you think that's a big way that these things will get done? Is by engaging the private sector? What's your experience of that?
Well, everyone's got their kind of agenda and their priority, right? So you're asking, is it problematic to have Pepsi fund a playground or something like that, right? Like, is it problematic to advertise something that might be negatively affecting children in one way, but putting their money toward a space in another way, right? So that's tricky. That's something that everyone kind of has to navigate based on their own value system and their own interests and priorities. I would say that, overwhelmingly, the more stakeholders you involve in the process to begin with, the more likely that the space will be used and will land in a direction that's actually beneficial to the community at large. So I would say public-private partnerships work best when they're very well balanced with the public agenda, and not letting the kind of private agenda take over. So thinking of what are the benchmarks throughout the process that would allow you to measure whose agenda is the main one here, and being aware of that. So I think overwhelmingly having a diverse pot of funding for these projects can be quite positive, but it's that diversity and that mixture that's important. Let's do one more question and then go outside.
In the early childhood world, especially inside but also outside, there are measures that are used. Eckers and Itters are ones the United States used a lot. I'm wondering if there's been any informing from them, and whether you think about going inside, because the traffic flow and the play spaces inside early learning centers are also can be very carefully crafted and be really well informed by some of this research you've done. Has there been any dialoguing between those worlds?
That's a good question. I think our space is really the public realm. And so to the extent that an inside space is public, would be a space that we would be interested in specifically. And of course, there's many indoor public spaces. A private space that's looking to foster better social connection or something like that, we'd have to be invited in, of course. We can't just kind of go in there and make suggestions. But I do think that's a good point, and I do think people are thinking about that. It hasn't quite come across our radar yet. One more quick one, sure.
Yeah, in big cities, children are not allowed to go by themselves and explore their environment by themselves. Do we have any evidence on the impact that may have on brain development?
Yes. I won't quote exact research, though, because I don't have anything in front of me. I don't want to misquote. But there are, of course, different cultural approaches to letting kids roam free or not. And I know, for example, in the Danish context, where we had the study tour with the Bernard Van Leer Foundation last year, there is a lot more freedom. And a lot of that culture has to do with they're much more social culture in terms of social services. So nobody is suing each other over, oh, my kid hurt their foot on the playground, because all of the healthcare is free. So the liability question is really absent in a lot of, Scandinavian countries, for example. And so I think that has an impact on what you'll let your kids do. There's also this cultural interest in letting kids roam free and kind of setting their own boundaries within like a safe, boundary that a parent has set, but maybe not explicitly laid out. So they have, for example, kids going to what they call nature school, which is where kids go out into the woods with saws and tools and build stuff all day and then come back, and they've learned to set their own boundaries. And that's not something that's as prevalent in the United States. Lucretia, my colleague, who's right behind you, who I'll introduce you to before we go outside, actually had mentioned just kind of anecdotally that she was looking for some equivalent nature school around Central Park, around this neighborhood even, in New York, and there wasn't really anything like that for her toddler. So it does vary across cultures, and when we come back to talk about this, I'd love to hear your different perceptions on what you'd observed. The Columbia campus is quite rooted in the English tradition, I think. And then you'll see also the park we'll go to is also from around that same time period, a similar kind of design. And so it would be great to hear what you see in your public spaces at home and how that compares. So the field guide is a little bit complicated to dive into if you've never used it before. I'll just give you a little bit of an orientation. There's 4 tools in here, I think. The people moving count, the age and gender tally, the stationary activity mapping, and the quality criteria. For the moving counts, you'll go to there's like a map on here. There's the map of the South Lawn, which is being resodded, so you can't go on it. You won't see people on it, but on the left side, just to orient you, I think that's probably the space like right outside the journalism building where you'd been eating lunch. So you can go out there and see if there's people out there and do a moving count there. You can walk to one of these walkways in the middle where you'll see people getting college tours or orientations or something, whatever people are doing on the campus in the summer, people like yourselves. You'll just draw a line across about a 15-foot space, and you'll watch people going across that line, and you'll do it for about 10 minutes, and you'll mark on your tally here where they belong, and then you'll total them up. If you don't see 100 people in 10 minutes for a proper study, we'd ask you to stay there a little bit longer to get like a statistically interesting result. But for the purpose of today, just stand there for 10 minutes, and you can pick any spot. So kind of fan out, do whatever. And we'll ask you to do one of the tools of people moving. So that would be either people moving or age and gender tally in parentheses, people moving, which starts on page 16. So that's where you're counting people moving by, but you're not counting if they're on bikes or cars or whatever. You're mostly just counting, well, probably pedestrians and the occasional bike or scooter, and you're marking where they belong on this chart also for 10 minutes. For people staying, that would be like on page 12, for example, age and gender people staying, or starting on page 24, stationary activity mapping. You would indicate like on the map where the person is. So there's these posture diagrams. So for a standing person, you draw a little circle. Sitting public means they're sitting on public property. Sitting commercial means they're sitting at a cafe or something. Sitting informal means they're sitting on something that wasn't intended to be a chair. So even sitting on the floor or sitting on a fire hydrant would be considered that. Moving around, obviously, lying down, and then other, if you can't describe what it is they're doing, leaning or, I don't know, swimming, maybe that's other. Dancing, yeah. Well, maybe that could be moving around. Anyway, you draw a little symbol on here, and then you mark where they belong in this chart. This one, the staying exercises are not timed, so you just go around and kind of estimate what would have been a snapshot of that space. So if you'd been in a drone or a hot air balloon and you took a snapshot, where would everyone have been? And so if people come and go while you're doing that, don't get too fussed about it. But we also have spots for notes where you can take notes. And then the quality criteria, of course, is just happy face, sad face, medium face. How you feel that it answers these sentences. For example, I feel safe from traffic-related accidents. I feel secure from crime and violence, etc. So do 2 tools in each. So we're going to do 2 groups. So these 2 table chunks go with one group, these 2 go in the other, and then you guys can kind of split in the middle. Me and Esther back here. Have you met Esther yet? We'll take one group, and Patrin and Lucretia will take another group. So Patrin and Lucretia are going to head to Morningside Park first for about 15 minutes, and then come back to the campus and use the campus as our laboratory for 15 minutes. And me and Esther are going to do the opposite. We'll start on campus, and then we'll go over there. And then I think normally we'd like to do a debrief outside. I think it's a little bit too hot today, so we won't subject you to that if you're wilting. But let's try to get back here by 2:10 so that we can have a 20-minute discussion and then a small break before your next session. So if you have questions, just come up to one of the four of us. Take drinks. I have sunscreen if anyone needs it. So yeah, just a quick informal debrief. I just love to hear, what you saw, what you felt, what you observed, besides heat and thirst. And I'd love for Patrin to help tease out some of the specific questions about early childhood. Maybe you guys saw like one or two kids, and we can of course speculate like, oh, it's too hot to bring the kids out, or where the kids are just not on the university campus today. I don't know. But I would love for Patrin if you had any questions lined up, or we can just ask for open comments.
You can start by asking for open comments, go into some more specific ones, but I'd also love to hear just what people saw and heard and felt and so on.
Yeah, and specifically, like, what stories come out of this? What's interesting about any of this?
We had a friend falling down.
I know, I saw that.
One of too many stairs.
Right, the access is a lot of stairs. It's true. It's so steep stairs could be inaccessible to strollers, to older people, to even fairly healthy younger people potentially. What else?
Park was particularly safe. I was here 20 years ago. I'm really old. And it was amazing to see what a difference 20 years can make, because there were kids and adults, and there were people lying in the grass and playing with their kids. There was little impromptu barbecue, and then there was a playground that was really robust and noisy, and I don't think 20 years ago you would have seen any of that. It was pretty heavily drug dealer den.
So what do you think made the difference?
We were actually sort of debating that. Gentrification of the neighborhood would be one hypothesis. Why it got gentrified, I don't know. One theory was the Clintons moved their foundation to Harlem and people started moving uptown.
Mm-hmm.
My theory is that families are staying in New York and they've gotten bigger and they have to go to where the real estate's more affordable. But I don't know. So I think maybe more money, maybe city investment. I actually don't know the mechanism.
Yeah, but families staying in the city, I think, is something that's a potential goal of Urban 95. So being able to observe and measure that could be interesting as an argument. It's related to gentrification, of course, but thinking about how there's positive effects of families staying in the city creates safer spaces is an interesting story.
Well, we were noticing that there on the campus, all the green spaces don't have any shade. And so for a day like today, nobody was on those green spaces, but nobody would want to anyways. And I feel like that would probably be that way the whole of the summer. Not great.
Right, so a space potentially designed without thinking about the needs of people. It's a very grand, very regal feeling space, but it doesn't encourage you to loiter, right? The buildings are where they want you to be.
We noticed that at the park, there were guys cycling and jogging, so I think the space provided there is suitable for that kind of activity. Yeah, and there was a lot of walking, of course, inside, just right outside.
I saw a beautiful scene. A girl, she was running, and I think his brother was seeing her running, and he was in the roller, and he just jumped and started running with her. So I think it's because I was in the entrance of the Columbia University, and I think it's a very inviting place, and nice and safe. So sometimes I had a bad time in my city with stroller, like because it was very hard, you know, to get out, and I was thinking twice about going out, and it was very nice to see the scene because I believe that it's very better for the kids when they can run free instead of being in the stroller, sitting in the stroller.
Did it feel safe for kids to run around outside where you were observing?
Yes.
Good. Did anybody see anything like surprising or you know, that out of the ordinary that you didn't expect, or that made you wonder like what's going on here?
I think it has been mentioned, but the barbecue and the music was kind of unexpected for me. And in addition to that, and also about what AD was saying, it's difficult not to relate from what is your own experience in your country. So we had a hard time feeling safe because we obviously compare with where we come from. And I don't know if there are like ways you think about the thing that you're not relating to what you experience out of here. How do you address that? And even for the unexpected, the barbecue, I would never do outside for so many reasons, and that's why it was unexpected for me.
Yeah.
Also, can I add?
Yeah.
There was no provision for the blind. There was nothing for the blind.
Are there? Did you notice on walk signs? Was there any audible or
No,
sorry,
nothing.
like braille or nothing like
Yeah.
that?
Nothing on the pavement either.
Yeah.
Traffic lights.
Like you said, we compare to our countries, and the playground is, how do you say, safe. In Brazil, we have many parks that you have always to be watching your kid, otherwise she can run to the street. So it's a very protected place.
Did these tools seem like something you could use in your work? Did they feel translatable to you, or did you notice any ways, you know, categories you would have added, or different tools you would like to see? I feel like the interview one might have been the most fun for you guys as journalists, so I left it intentionally out so that you could experience just observing instead and taking notes. But how did that feel? Or if you wanted to make a different comment or question, you can.
Well.
Give you a break.
I really liked how you shared in your slides earlier about how things are measured in cities and how we experience them. And so I was paying attention to, in the first place, when we were, and a lot of the grass was roped off and everything felt very constricted, and I felt constricted. And then I got to the greener space in the park and just noticing that people were actually interacting, lying down, talking, and I just felt a sense of relief. So I liked also how the tool kind of keyed me into my own reactions.
That's interesting. There's also something about, you know, in the campus it's all kind of straight lines, and so you have this line of sight where you can see ahead and you can see it's safe, but you can also see there's nothing all that interesting potentially in front of you versus the park where there's these, you know, meandering kind of places where you can get lost, and I think that really affects the feeling that you're describing as well. Need time for maybe one more comment, otherwise we can wrap it up. Yes, Anna?
I was struck by the diversity in the park of age and race, and it was like exactly the kind of environment I think anybody would want in any city park. Just people doing a variety of activities, and everybody felt safe. So, and I don't know if that has to do with where it's located or not, but I don't know. I appreciated that. It was nice.
Great. Well, I hope you have learned something here today. I've certainly, learned a lot from listening to you all, and I wish I had time to hear all of your stories. But I hope you'll keep in touch. I think Kate shared my email with all of you guys. We do a number of public programs that we invite people to. We have our annual convening in Detroit this year in September, which will be open to anyone. If you wanted a smaller, more directed experience, we do master classes, several times a year for folks. The next one is in Copenhagen in August. And it's, this workshop, but over the course of 3 days, and doing a little more in-depth work with the tools and talking to more people about it. And if you have ideas of how you can use this in your work, or if you do use it, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to answer more questions via email. I also want to thank Lucretia for joining us today. Thank you. Who was telling me, earlier about how her, they have 2 strollers for their kid and like the different terrain. And it actually would have been interesting if you had brought Matthias as like a live demonstration of all of this stuff that we're learning about early childhood development. But in the absence of small children, it's a little safer for everyone, maybe.
Well, thank you both so much for this. And thank you most of all for this central, powerful idea of 95 centimeters and of viewing the world from that perspective. That, for me, is a game changer as a reporter. That goes into the toolkit permanently when thinking about all kinds of issues, not just urban design. So thank you for that.